The Neoliberal Podcast is part of the Neoliberal Project and made possible by our members and supporters. If you enjoy the podcast and want to become a member of the project, head to neoliberalproject.org/join. You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/neoliberalproject. These members and patrons help cover the podcast's expenses and make it all happen. Thanks for your support and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining us today is Ashley All. Ashley is the Director of Communications for Kansans for Constitutional Freedom, and she is one of the leaders of the no vote on Kansas's recent constitutional amendment to effectively ban abortion in the state of Kansas, which was defeated. And that's what we're talking about today, is the fight for abortion access and women's rights in Kansas, how that went down, and what it means for the rest of the country. So, Ashley All, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I'm really, really glad to have you. I think so many people were really both interested in this fight from kind of the perspective of like, we don't know what's going to happen. This is like one of the first big high profile fights in the post Roe v. Wade world. And also obviously very encouraged by what happened. But before we get into the actual amendment itself and the actual ballot measure, I'd love to just get an introduction for you. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about how you got here? Like, what's your story? How did you end up in Kansas politics? How long have you been working in politics? And how did you end up as part of this fight?
I actually have been working in Kansas politics for 18 years now. I grew up in Kansas pretty much my entire life. My family is from here. And so I got my start right after college working on legislative races. And then my first statewide race was an attorney general's race in 2006, which we won. And then I just kind of continued to stay involved and kind of was addicted to, politics, but also really making a difference in my community and the community where my family lives. And so I have been doing that now for a long time. And this race was something personal to me. And I got involved at the request of a couple other people, but also at my own request. I really wanted to be part of this. This is an issue that's important to me personally, but for a lot of reasons, politically, but also I have 4 daughters. And for me, it's beyond abortion rights. It's more about equality, women's rights, and the rights of my daughters to grow up in a world where they have equal rights to men. And so I was really fortunate to be part of this team. We had a great team, and I've been at this for about a year now.
I think that's actually an underrated point that I want to get back to, but later on in the conversation, about how, this is not just a bunch of childless, hippie liberals who are doing this. This is parents, this is mothers who can still support this. But we'll get into all that. You did say that you've got deep roots in Kansas. I'm going to take a stab. Are you by any chance a Jayhawk or a Wildcat?
I am a Jayhawk. Actually, I went to both, but I ended up as a Jayhawk.
Well, rock chalk then. University of Kansas graduate.
Yeah.
So let's set the stage for this campaign. I guess, when did you first realize this was something that you not just you wanted to work on, but this was a campaign that needed to happen? Was this kind of like, as soon as Roe v. Wade was overturned, you immediately knew that there was going to be a fight here? When did this kind of actual ballot measure or amendment to the Constitution get proposed? And when did the fight around this issue start?
This actually has been a long time coming in Kansas. Back in 2019, our Kansas Supreme Court ruled on a case relating to some restrictions that were put in place by our legislature. There was, a challenge to the law, and it worked its way through the court system and ultimately resulted in a ruling by our Kansas Supreme Court that found that Kansans have a broad right to personal autonomy. And what that meant was that, Kansans were had the right to make decisions about their body, about their freedom, about their family, their future. And for women, that included the right to make choices about pregnancy or abortion. And that set off a chain reaction, as you might imagine, in the legislature here, which tends to be much more conservative.
And that was in 2016.
That was in 2019.
Oh, 2019.
Yeah, when the decision came down. And right after that, in 2020, some conservative anti-choice lawmakers tried to push through the constitutional amendment. And fortunately, there was a kind of bipartisan coalition of lawmakers who blocked it in 2020. Unfortunately, the 2020 elections in Kansas shifted the legislature enough that allowed them to pass it in early 2021. So in 2021, they put this on they passed it, both houses, 2/3 majority, put it on the primary election ballot in 2022. And from that point on, this organization that I worked for began to organize, became official in the summer of 2021, and really has been doing work, foundational work since then to get ready for the vote that we just had in August. I got involved last fall, but even before I was involved, there was work amongst coalition partners, really just to get ready to have this fight.
What was the scale of the fight that you're looking at? Because obviously this seems like a pretty daunting task. Kansas is a state that goes for Donald Trump double digits in both elections, and frankly for conservative Republicans for quite a long time, at least on the national level. And it has a Democratic governor now, but it also has a history of electing very conservative governors like Sam Brownback.
Absolutely.
And
yeah,
then
absolutely.
there's other even complicating factors like the language itself in the amendment being very kind of confusing, and it's being held on a primary where, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but with a Democratic governor, there's essentially no competitive Democratic primaries during this election, and tons of like Republican primaries. So you'd expect this to be like a very biased kind of electorate.
Absolutely. And that is exactly what they were expecting. They put it on the primary ballot very intentionally, hoping that it would be a traditional turnout in a primary election. And in Kansas, that tends to be heavily Republican and far more partisan. In Kansas, we actually have 44% of our registered voters are Republican, 26% are Democrats, and there's a 29% group of unaffiliated voters who are just registered to vote but do not affiliate with a party. And so they never vote in an August partisan primary. And so they put it on that ballot because they hoped that that would ensure that it would pass. And so from that point on, back in 2021, we knew that this was going to be a very difficult fight. We understood that the dynamics of a primary election electorate, was very different than a general election electorate. And so we really had to start building a coalition of partners that could cross partisan lines and have conversations with a lot of different Kansans who agreed with us. There was some polling, public polling back in at the end of last year that made it very clear that we could win this. 60% of Kansans supported access in that survey. Obviously, that was a more general election sample, but we knew that it was possible. We understood that Kansans, by and large, were on our side. We just needed to be able to communicate in a way that they could understand, and that they that resonated with a broad and diverse coalition of voters. And so that was really what we spent the last year preparing to do, having a lot of conversations, doing a lot of research, and really understanding how regular Kansans talk about and think about the issue of abortion.
So I want to get into those kind of like tactic by tactic kind of strategic questions about how you ran this campaign. But before we do, I'd also love for just a minute to talk about Kansas as a state, because it's got a really interesting political history
Hmm.
that, young people growing up in coastal areas or in big cities may not know, especially if they slept through portions of their U.S. history class in high school. Which, I mean, look, we've all been there. It's fine. I'm not trying to call you out, guys, but we all know that you don't pay attention sometimes. But, Kansas has this really interesting history. It was the Missouri versus Kansas kind of
Hmm.
free state, slave state battle around the time of the Civil War is a whole thing. And I find myself kind of torn between two narratives here. Like, Kansas is a very red state. And so on the one hand, you can just kind of simplistically say, like, Kansas is Republican, dominated by Republicans, dominated by conservatives, red, 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 Donald Trump, MAGA, red hat, blah, blah, blah. It's very easy to just kind of tell that simple story. And I think there's a level on which the simple story is correct in some ways. But then, like I said, Kansas has this complicated history. It does have a Democratic governor now. So I wonder, do you think the story is more complex than that? Or is it really just very Republican and that's all you need to know? How do you think
Yeah,
about this?
it absolutely is more complicated than that. As you mentioned, Kansas has free state roots. We came into the Union and fought very hard to come into the Union as a free state, despite, battles along the border and all kinds of things that were happening. And I think that set the stage for kind of what Kansans and how Kansans feel about certain issues and about, certain personal liberties. We, really are more of a moderate state, I would say. Yes, right now, the legislature leans very conservative, but really, I think that's a more recent thing in the last decade or two. That does not extend our entire history. Absolutely, if you look at U.S. Senate races. Democrats haven't won one in over 80 years, I think is the number. But we have had multiple
That is quite
Democratic
a number.
governors. Yeah, 80 years. But we've had multiple Democratic governors. Kathleen Sebelius served 2 terms here in Kansas in the early 2000s. Laura Kelly is obviously finishing her first term as governor and running for reelection right now. But there are others before that. So I think that Kansans are pragmatic and more moderate than I think the national narrative lets on. But even knowing that, and even having grown up here, I also have a very healthy dose of realism, and I also understand that this was going to be a very hard race to win, given the dynamics of a primary election. And sometimes in Kansas you do all the things right, you work very hard, you run a perfect race, and you still lose because it's just the partisan makeup of the state. But that was not the case in this situation. So we really did work hard to build bridges amongst different coalitions of voters, Republicans, moderates, Democrats, progressives. I mean, however people wanted to identify themselves, we were willing to have conversations with them about this important issue.
So that's kind of the clay that you're working with. This is Kansas. It's what you've got to appeal to. It's what the voters you have to win are these kind of people. What did you actually do tactically that you think helped make this a win? Because, we can say all we want about, well, Kansas has this really interesting history and they don't like to be told what to do. They don't like people imposing on them. But at the same time, if this was run without much of a political campaign, you'd expect it would be difficult to win by the margin that you did. So I'm very curious, when you guys started organizing, what was the tactical strategy? Like, what was the guiding principle for how we want to appeal to people? What kind of language are we going to use? What kind of methods are we going to use? Is it going to be television? Is it going to be door knocking? Which specific phrases should we use or avoid? Like, how did you guys think about all of these kind of small tactical decisions?
Well, so I would say we started with a much smaller goal. The first goal we started with really was to understand how Kansans, how regular people, not partisan, candidates or political, operatives, but how real people talk or think about the issue of abortion. And so we, did research. We had a lot of conversations with folks, and what came through pretty clearly is that most people don't think about abortion as a partisan issue. And I know to many of us who have worked in that environment for a long time in politics, that seems like very strange. And but at the same time, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. I mean, most people don't even, really think about the issue or talk about the issue until they have to. And so, we when we were having conversations with Kansans and really like trying to get at, how they thought about it, how they identified, whether they identified as pro-choice or pro-life, or anything in between, or it became very clear that this really was a much more personal decision, and it was a much more complicated issue for people. For some, it was a private medical decision that had to be made. Some, it was a personal, moral, or religious issue. And so, knowing all that, we very much approached this campaign as a nonpartisan campaign. I mean, we stayed away from the traditional partisan frames that this issue tends to be talked about in, and we looked at different ways that Kansans talked about it. And when we began having those conversations, we realized that the way most people understood it, they may have personal feelings about the issue of abortion, but ultimately they believed that we should protect the constitutional rights of women to make those decisions. And so we kind of pulled back a little bit, a much broader message that really focused on protecting the constitutional rights and freedom of Kansas women to make these decisions for themselves. And that is a shared value that we found that most Kansans, regardless of political party, shared. And that really resonated with people across the political spectrum. I think there was a lot of, interest in one of our first ads, and people really thought that we were, directing this message to more conservative voters. And what I would like to point out
Well,
is
and what did the ad say? If you can just let us know what
it
was the language being used?
The language in the first ad talked about this being this was a mandate. It was the amendment would mandate government control over your private medical decisions and pave the way to a total ban on abortion. And that initial ad was, obviously just the starting point for our conversation on television. But what was interesting was, a lot of people thought that was, directed at more conservative voters. But what's interesting is that message, the message of protecting constitutional rights, the message about freedom, that was the top message for all groups, our base voters, Democrats, progressives, moderates, conservatives. That is something that is a shared value amongst all those groups of people, and it allowed us to communicate to a broad audience of people in terms that they understood and in terms that really mattered to them.
One of the really interesting things about the messaging that has been noted by, I think, many commentators is that you even ran one ad opposing this kind of initiative, this amendment, that didn't mention the word abortion at all. And all it said was, your private medical decisions shouldn't be interfered with by the government, basically something along those lines. And it got me curious in researching this episode, and I actually looked at some of the press hits you've done, because you've been interviewed by like Rolling Stone and profiled in the New Yorker, and you've been on NBC. It's been like probably the craziest week, I would imagine. It has actually, before I even ask, has it been like kind of a whirlwind, like getting all this national media attention?
Yeah, it's been pretty overwhelming. It's, as somebody who has worked with candidates, I am always behind the scenes. I do not seek camera. I don't seek the camera. I don't usually do interviews. I'm usually just, kind of the person that runs interference. But I made a commitment early on in this campaign, for personal reasons, because of my daughters, that I was going to do whatever was asked of me to make sure we won, because it was that important. And I got really uncomfortable. I did TV, for the first time. I've done a lot of interviews in a way that I've never have before. And it has been incredibly overwhelming. So, but it was important to me, and it was important to the state of Kansas, and it was important to our team that I do that.
Well, welcome to the national political conversation, Ashley All. It is both
Thank you.
horrifying and wonderful, I promise you. So, but where I was going with this, when you said you were like, new to television or whatever, I watched some of these press hits that you did, and there were entire like 7-minute long press hits that you would do without saying the word abortion once. So even on a personal level, I think your message discipline was like really strong.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what I tried to focus on, whether it was throughout the campaign or after we won, was really what values Kansans and I think what values Americans share. And those are values of freedom, they're values, of personal liberty. And really, we want to make sure that women have the right to make decisions about their bodies, about abortion, uh, for themselves. And I think that is something that is a unifying value, and really, helps us cross partisan lines on an issue that tends to be pretty divisive.
So once you figure out the messaging that you want to use, and I think it's a very interesting point, and we're going to talk more about it in a minute, but tactically in terms of television ads and on the ground stuff, was there a particular focus for this campaign? Do you think that there's a particular way that when you talk about abortion rights specifically, do you think that the ground game is more important? Do you think that really it's just about flooding the airwaves? How did you think about kind of the tactical message, not what words we're using, but how do we actually spread the message?
I think both components are really important. We absolutely understood that to communicate broadly, we needed to be on television. We needed to do radio in a lot of areas in rural Kansas. That's how they spend car rides, and so we really looked at television, radio. Obviously, has a huge component, and just different ways to reach all the different voters because voters, regardless of party, consume media, get their information different ways, and we just needed to make sure that we were speaking to as many people as we could, regardless of what party they were in. And so we did kind of all of the above. And when we did all the paid media that you typically do in a modern campaign, we also, I think, core to our success was our really large coalition of partners. As I mentioned earlier, we started with a core group, that kind of kicked off this Kansans for Constitutional Freedom group. But then over the course of the last year, it grew to be really pretty substantial. And it included organizations across the state that, some, focused mostly on moderate Republican voters, some really engaged with young progressive voters. And we worked with them to reach their, constituent groups and really to have conversations in the communities where they already existed, where they were trusted, trusted messengers. And that was, I think, really important as well, because it allows you to have conversations with people, who are in these cases neighbors of the coalition partners, and that I think opened the door to conversations that were pretty challenging. This issue isn't something that's easy to talk about, and that was really, I think, critical to our field operation. Our organization headed up the door knocking, kind of canvassing program in the 5 major counties, which was, basically like the Kansas City metro area, Wichita metro area, and then a couple others. But the vast majority of the field work that was done in other communities was done by partner organizations. And we did. I think we ended up knocking like 60,000 doors just with our volunteers over the summer. They made over 600,000 phone calls. Our volunteers did, and it was, and we had a really large group of older women who wanted to write lots and lots of postcards, and they did that too. And so we just really found ways to engage as many people as possible uh, with our campaign.
But wait, that can't be right, because I heard from Republicans in Kansas that this was defeated because of a radical left coalition that was all, socialist, communist, godless, atheist. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it was actually I spent a lot of time working with a group of moderate Republican former lawmakers who very much were pro-choice. That is the interesting thing that I think we will see as this issue unfolds across the country, that there are lots of Republicans, lots of moderates, lots of independents who absolutely support access to abortion and 100% believe that women deserve the right to make that decision for themselves.
What's interesting is how different this is from some of the other conversations you see kind of in the broader Democratic Party. And I know you've kind of stressed that this particular initiative shouldn't be considered a Democratic Party thing. It crossed party lines. But in the broader national conversation, this is obviously very associated with the Democratic Party. And, this podcast leans towards the Democratic Party. You've worked in Democratic politics. And in other parts of the country, like where I am, for instance, in New York, a lot of the things that you guys did just would not ever be thought of, like, putting a straight white male Christian pastor as kind of the centerpiece of an ad about abortion. It's just not something that would ever happen in New York City. First of all, nobody would have ever had that thought. Second of all, you would have gotten yelled at for not having enough representation. And not to like make light of that, but it's just very curious to me that I think this gets to kind of a broader disagreement within the Democratic Party about, well, how much should we be reaching out to moderate voters? Should we be trying to win over Republicans that we think we can sway? Or should we just kind of be motivating the base? Like, I'm curious, do you think there are lessons from this campaign? Or is this really just a singular thing?
I think that there are lots of things to learn. Absolutely, this campaign was very unique. I mean, how it even came to be was unique. But, I think one of the struggles that I have, I think a lot of people have, is just how divided the country has become. Everything is, incredibly polarized, and we have really lost our ability, to talk to people who are different than us. And I think that is unfortunate. And I think that is leading to a lot of problems, not just within the party, just within the country. And so, what we really focused on was having conversations and being willing to have conversations with people who differed from us on the issue. There are a lot of people in the middle on the issue of abortion who, kind of describe themselves as pro-choice, and some that describe themselves as pro-life. But, like once you start asking questions about whether or not, somebody, if their loved one needed an abortion, if they would support that, they move. And what we found was that people are far closer together than our political system kind of allows for. But the way you figure that out is by having conversations and being willing to have conversations with people who differ on the issue. And so what we did was we really did provide space for people to have differing opinions on the issue of abortion, have complicated feelings on the issue of abortion, and still come to support our core message, which was women deserve the right to make this decision for themselves. And that is, by definition, pro-choice.
The way I've heard this described before to me from like pollsters is that America probably has around 3 camps, and they're probably all about the same size. Of about a third of people basically would like to ban abortion, with very few exceptions, either no exceptions or almost no exceptions. About a third of people kind of want abortion to be broadly legal in almost all circumstances. And then there's about a third of people who are in this kind of middle ground of, well, I would support an abortion ban after a certain number of weeks, or, kind of with some stipulations, but it should be legal before these certain number of weeks. And there's kind of just this fuzziness, and that's the third camp. Does that
Right.
kind of track with your understanding of the issue?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I don't know if it would be a third, and a third. I think that the kind of there's like I would say a little bit smaller on the edges and then a big swath in the middle. But yeah, no, I think that there is a big group of people in the middle who have, kind of conflicted personal feelings about the issue. Whether they would whether they would choose to have an abortion themselves if they were in that situation. Maybe not. Um, but ultimately, when you have the conversation and you're presented with the choice, and in this case, our amendment was very clear. They were eliminating the constitutional right of women to make a decision about abortion for themselves. And when you present that to the vast majority of people, they understand that women deserve the right to make that choice because there are lots of complicated, you know, issues, lots of, gray area in the middle. And we really made it possible for them to have those complicated personal feelings, but also share, again, the core value, which is that women deserve the right to choose. And, to your earlier point, I mean, absolutely, we worked with messengers in our ads that absolutely represented and looked like Kansas, and that is different than other states. And I think that that's important. But I would say the message itself really did transcend party lines. I mean, progressive, moderate, conservative, all of our very dedicated base Democrats were motivated by the issue of equal rights and freedom to make decisions about abortion. And so that message, I think, can be used in a lot of different places. I mean, I think it was just used in an ad in New York that for is it Pat Ryan, who just won unexpectedly, where he talked about women's freedom.
Mm-hmm. I want to give a shout out to our New York chapter, by the way, because they were out there um, phone banking for Pat Ryan and were elated to see him win in a swing district that was very, very, very close. So one thing that strikes me is that Democrats benefit here when they can portray Republicans as being the extremists on this issue. If Democrats are viewed as the extremists, or if just the people who are pro-choice are viewed as extremists, then they're going to suffer and potentially lose. Whereas if you can paint the other side as the one with an extreme view, they want to ban all abortion in all cases, no exceptions, then you're more likely to win politically. And I guess that leads me to some conclusions that are sometimes uncomfortable for national Democrats, such as, like, there's an idea that's been floated that Democrats should start trying to force abortion votes in the House and the Senate. But rather than just legalize all abortion nationwide by congressional fiat, they should go for things like, well, there is a national right to abortion in the case of rape or incest, or a national right to abortion before 15 weeks, rather than just blanket legalization, because that would paint the Democrats as extremists. This is a conversation that's been had. People are arguing about this constantly.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a position there? Do you have kind of a point of view on whether or not that's a good idea? What should national Democrats be doing if they're trying to do something?
I think that's a really good conversation to have. I think it's complicated. As we said just a minute ago, I mean, each state's different. It's very complicated to have, this conversation nationally because there are a lot of varying positions. I think that for somebody like living in the Midwest and the South, we are at a crisis point. And so I think that there needs to be some effort, whether it's through Congress or whether it is through ballot initiatives like we have seen in Kansas or that are coming up in other states like Kentucky or Michigan. There needs to be efforts made by national organizations to support efforts like these to expand access in places that have almost none. I mean, it has been almost a year since Texas completely lost access. Oklahoma lost access. before the Dobbs decision. So, yes, there are conversations that need to be had about, what can be passed through Congress. But there are other ways to make, to expand access in places like Kansas, the South, and some of my own states, neighboring states, have some of the most extreme bans on the books, and that is causing heartbreaking stories every day that talk about women having care denied or delayed. It's calling into question care that is given not just for abortion, but for miscarriages and other pregnancy related challenges. Not to mention the treatment of a 10-year-old rape victim in Ohio. I mean, all of those stories show that we are at a crisis point and something has to change just to get minimal protection for women for their lives. We need some sort of change. And so I think that is going to it's going to require not just Democrats, but, independents, Republicans too, at the national level to be willing to have a conversation and really look at options that are different than what we've been doing in the past.
One thing I want to circle back to, because we mentioned it earlier in the podcast, you are a mother, I think, of 3 or 4 daughters.
I actually have 5 children. Two are my stepchildren who are 21, a boy and a girl, and then I have 3 daughters of my own.
Okay, so 4 daughters overall and 5 children overall. And one of the things that was interesting to me is that in addition to kind of the non-traditional abortion message of putting a Christian pastor up to talk about why you should vote no here, you also put, grandmothers and mothers here, women who have already had children who are talking about why they needed to have an abortion at some point. And I think people would be surprised, actually. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but a great deal of the abortions in this country are actually people who have already had children. Can you talk about, as a mother, why this is important to you?
Well, I think that each one of us, regardless of whether you're a mother like I am or a grandmother, or, even a woman, I mean, each of us has connections to people who have had either challenging pregnancies, life-threatening issues during their pregnancies, for some reason, whether it was by choice or, through no decision of their own, had to have an abortion to save their life, or, have gone through miscarriage. We all have people in our lives who have gone through that. It's very personal and often not talked about. And so, I do think that, what we tried to do, again, was use messengers that helped people understand the issue and how many people are touched by it. And that is, we absolutely had a mother, Kelsey, in one of our ads who talked about having to have an abortion, and how she did it because it was going to cost her life otherwise. And she had a husband and a child already, and that was, and she needed to be there for them. And that is a decision that she had to make. And that is the conversation that anti-choice lawmakers and politicians do not want to have. Because when you start looking at these complicated stories and the real world implications of these bans, the impact that they'll have on women's healthcare, the women, that is when people understand that this is a really critical issue to women, to families, and so we really tried to have a conversation and share stories, across different, with different people, whether that was me as a mother being the spokesperson, whether that was, a doctor talking about how this impacted his ability to care for patients. That's the real world. I mean, that is what abortion care looks like. And that is the conversation that we really tried to center.
I did manage to find the number, actually, while I was looking it up while you were giving that answer, and it's 60%. 60% of women who have abortions already have children. And like you said, this touches everyone. But I just think it would shock a lot of people to know how many already existing mothers need to get abortions for whatever various reasons. I just don't think that fits the stereotype, and it's something that I think is important to talk about. So,
Yeah,
um,
I think it's, what the other side has done well for the past 50 years is paint a picture of who has, who accesses abortion care, and who, what that means. They have painted it in extreme,
it's a godless atheist who just wants to party some more, and doing abortions 3 times a month, and like, I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's kind of the picture that they'd like to paint, it seems like.
yeah, what the other side has done well for the past 50 years is really paint a inaccurate picture of who gets abortions in this country. Typically, it is, somebody who is young and frivolous, and using it as birth control, and that is absolutely not the case. The vast majority of people who access abortion have already had children, and not only that, I mean, the vast majority of abortions occur very, very early in pregnancy. And so, but that's not what helps move the needle for them. It is the extreme cases. It's discussion, of procedures and things that don't actually even exist in medical terms. And that is how they win races. That's how they've been able to scare people into voting in a certain way for the past many years. But when you look at the issue closely, and when you have conversations with people across the political spectrum, the vast majority of people believe that women should be able to make that decision for themselves. And the extreme bans that have been put in place recently in a lot of different states, the trigger bans that have gone into place, those are absolutely out of step with the vast majority of Americans. And I think that's what we're seeing in states like Kansas. People are saying no.
There was a really interesting quote that I'd love to get your reaction to, and this was from a senior Democratic strategist talking about your work, basically, in the Kansas campaign. And the quote is, "These concepts will find their way into Democratic messaging at all levels of the country." What's your reaction to that, kind of hearing that your work might spread that way?
I mean, I'm flattered. We absolutely think that it should. I think that it is a different way to communicate about this issue that is important. Regardless of party, there are ways to communicate about this issue that really resonate with people, and I think we proved that. I'm encouraged to see some of the messaging in the last couple of weeks around this issue, because it does sound a little bit different. And I'm hopeful that we're able to make progress in places, places that aren't New York. It's more complicated in other states, and we need to have conversations about it that sound a little bit more like the states that we're looking to win. So yeah, no, I'm pleased. I'm pleased that there has been some shift. I'm hopeful that continues, and I hope that strategist is right.
This is something I think about all the time, because I think about national politics more than I think about state politics. And that's the role, that's my lane that I'm in. And honestly, we probably have too many people in this country who think about national politics and not enough people who think about state politics. So I'm very glad you exist, number one. But number two, I do worry about the national politics. And I look at Democrats and I think, look, Democrats can't win unless they are winning in red states. There are not enough safe Democratic blue seats in the House or in the Senate. If the Democrats want to have a Democratic Senate, for instance, they're going to have these Democratic senators from places like Montana and West Virginia and Arizona and potentially Kansas, and potentially, we had somebody from Missouri a decade back and somebody from North Dakota not too recently. And, these are the kind of places we have to win. And obviously it's different when you're doing a whole campaign and not just one issue. But do you think that this is part of a broader struggle, that like Democrats are sometimes have lost their way in the red and purple areas of the country?
having worked in Kansas for 18 years, I think that what we have always had to do, is communicate in a different way. We couldn't use and we shouldn't use the national talking points. It doesn't it's just not the language that
Well,
works in
and
our state.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to ask a related question since you mentioned that the messaging versus other states. Sorry, it popped into my head. But one of the interesting things I've heard, and I wonder if you agree with this, is that messaging from New York and California Democrats makes it harder to be, for instance, a Kansas Democrat. That like if AOC says something crazy, that it comes back and it ends up affecting races in Kansas and Montana, and it's easy to kind of all Democrats are like this crazy person in California or whatever the case may be. Do you think there's any truth to that, or do you think that no, we've just got to, it doesn't really matter, we've got to buckle down?
I don't think it, I think that we just need to be open to talking about issues in different ways. And what is okay in New York or California, and what works in those areas maybe doesn't work in Texas or Kansas or Ohio. I mean, we just have to be willing to communicate differently, and I think that it's not an either. I mean, it's not an either or. I mean, Kansas, the messaging that we used in our campaign worked across the board. We have very liberal and progressive areas in the state of Kansas. I live in one of them, the college town of Lawrence. It is absolutely progressive, and you could use a lot of the messages that you use in some of the most blue states. But the message that we used resonated very strongly with base voters, with progressive voters. And so it's not like we lose those people, we lose our base if we communicate this way. In fact, those values of equality, fairness, equal rights, all of that. I mean, those are core to the Democratic Party. And so talking about issues in that frame uh, should be on brand for Democrats. And there are a lot of politicians in both parties who, you know, survive because they drive wedges between, different areas and create more division. That's how they win. And my hope is that we don't allow that to happen amongst our own party, when really we can work together to move in a direction that allows for some understanding of the issues and allows for some diversity in opinions, but also shares really core values, like equality, and like freedom.
So we've got just a little bit of time left, and one thing I'd love to do is ask about the actual night that you won.
I was pretty surprised. I absolutely thought that there was a path to win. As I mentioned earlier, there was polling that said, 60% of Kansans supported access. And so, we knew that the vast majority of the state was with us. What we didn't know was who was going to show up. And so, because this was a primary election, the electorate was going to be very different than what a general election electorate would be. And so we were a little bit uncertain about who would show up and how it would kind of unfold through the night. But things started coming in and looking very positive. And because I have worked in Kansas for 18 years, I tend not to celebrate until it is absolutely over. And that was the case this year as well. I think even more so this year because I was personally, this was a very personal race for me for a lot of reasons, and I just couldn't kind of let myself believe that we were going to win at any point until it was done. Because I think that losing after having that hope would have been very very crushing to me. But
Well,
when it was,
instead of
yeah,
getting crushed, though, you did win. How gratifying was it to watch those results come in with all the work that you've been doing and talking about how personal this was for you and important for your family? How gratifying was that just to see it come in that night?
it really was overwhelming. I mean, our team, our campaign staff, we all just felt, we had done everything possible. Each one of us, our campaign manager, Rachel Sweet, our field director, Helena Buckman, and numerous other people uh, made a commitment that we were going to leave it all on the field, and we worked around the clock. And so when those results came in, I don't think we could even describe the feeling. I mean, it really was overwhelming, and just so gratifying.
All right, so we're nearly at time. I want to ask our traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast, and that is, where can people go to learn more? This could be a particular book they should read, a particular blog that's good on this issue, a Twitter account to follow, a white paper to read, and anything at all that you think would be helpful for people who are interested in everything we've been talking about, who want to learn more about either the politics of this or just learn more about abortion as a political issue in America. What's the reality? Where would you recommend that they go if they want to get more information?
To their neighbors. I mean, I honestly think that we need to have more conversations with our neighbors and the people around us. And so I've been doing this for a long time, and I've, every interview I've done, I think in the last couple of weeks, I don't know if it's ever run, but what I've encouraged people to do is go out and have conversations with people who are different than you, and you will learn a lot. Some you'll disagree with, but you will learn a lot, and you will realize that we are much closer together, and we share much more than I think political pundits and candidates and politicians believe.
Well, I want to speak for many, many people around the country when I say thank you for your work in Kansas. And I think it's given a lot of people hope in a time that hope was somewhat lacking. And I hope that progress can be made from here. I want to thank you one more time for coming on the podcast. Our guest today has been Ashley All. Ashley, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.